Welcome back to the Pilgrim Faith Podcast, where human wonder fuels the quest for Christian wisdom. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by my good friend, Paul Nedelisky, who's been here a couple of times. He's a friend of both Dale and I, and a friend of our podcast. And we always have fun conversations with Paul, and this one will be no exception. Paul and Dale and several other friends and I have, for the last couple of years, unbeknownst to everyone else, of course, been really fascinated by this kind of typical boomer American male topic of Bigfoot and UFOs and creepy, creepy paranormal cryptid stuff, and not because you believe the whole thing, but it's because you're interested in the fact that there's an enormous amount of people that claim to have seen these kinds of things. And Paul's one of these fun guys that I've met who, he wears this one hat of being an extraordinarily intelligent philosopher with a powerful mind, and he wears this other hat of listening to more verbal testimony about these things than I've ever met anybody in my life who listens to verbal testimony about these things. And one of the things we wanted to bring together, I suppose, as a discourse in this particular conversation is just the value of that itself, the value of verbal testimony. And we'll organically get into that in a bit, because of course we have a faith that's based on, in many ways, verbal testimony. And so thinking through what does it mean to point out reliable versus unreliable verbal testimony about extraordinary claims, I think that just as Christians is just an interesting thing to think through. But before we, I suppose, get into those principled questions and that sort of thing, part of the reason, of course, this is the right time to talk about this is it's in the news all over. You have the Congress is now having official hearings about these kinds of things. And, a lot of Christians are probably like, I don't know what to make of these things. Paul has thought a lot about this. And I suppose first, Paul, I just love, a couple of, biographical question or two, just to fill the picture out here for us a little bit. How does a person who, on the one hand, goes off and becomes a philosopher also get super, super interested in listening to many hours of testimonies about just kind of
more than anyone knew until now, Joe? You've blown my cover.
Well, sorry, brother.
No, that's fine. No. How did I get into it? I think the story. I think there are a lot of stories like this. It happened during COVID. Different regions of America sort of shut down at different levels of intensity and for different durations. Charlottesville, where I live, it was pretty intense. Basically, no one left their house for a couple months when kind of from middle of March onward. And so, we're all in here. I'm with my family, and there's a lot of good family togetherness. But I started doing a lot more cooking, and first I started trying to listen to things related to my academic interests. There are a ton of great podcasts about philosophy, about history, about ideas, but they required too much concentration. And it would take me 3 hours to finish cooking because I'm like trying to mentally keep track of what people are saying. And then I'm forgetting, was it 1 cup or 2 cups or whatever. But one day I was like, I am interested in all these alleged Bigfoot sightings. That's kind of how it started. I ran across this podcast called Sasquatch Chronicles. And I thought, I'm going to listen to an episode. It was just idle curiosity. And I happened to listen to one where the person telling the story, it was somebody who had spent the night in this mountain cabin and had this strange experience. They struck me as very credible. They didn't seem to be very polished. It wasn't clear they had any incentive to make the story up. These podcasts operate on a shoestring budget. They're not making a lot of money. Something you might realize, Joe, also. It's about goodwill. It's about, you have other interests. And so I was surprised how credible I found this person. And at the same time, these stories hit that sweet spot where they were interesting, but I could keep cooking and I wouldn't mess up the recipes. And so I kept listening to more and more, and it kind of became this ritual. I'd get home from work, start in on dinner, put on a podcast, and certainly not all of them are credible. There are a lot of people out there who I think any sane person would realize this is a sensationalist. This is someone who wants attention. But there are people where if you hear the story, I think most of us would be like, I'm surprised how credible I'm finding this, given the content that this person is talking about, the content of the experience, given what they're saying that they saw. And over the period of the next 2 or 3 years, I became more credulous of some of the things that I was hearing about. Just kind of a long story. But that's how I got into it. I don't know if you want to share how you got into it. It's, it's not, as you said, it's not a mainstream thing, but
no, I don't think it was largely, I think, through discourse with folks like you and others where, it was always something that I figured, there's probably just kind of a simple explanation for this. And most of it's, incredulous or something like that. And tons of it is. But a lot of it was meeting people who I take seriously. So it's like, I have enough of a kind of a bad version of conspiracy theory background that I've developed through my adult life, some sense of like, yeah, that's not a particularly that's not a particularly clear claim. There's you'd have to have a lot more evidence for this, that, or the other.
right.
And so same thing, kind of with that hat on, with all those filters, with all those defense mechanisms on. There is something unique about just listening to somebody tell a story of what happened to them. And especially, I'm something of a storyteller. I can sensationalize, I can come up with a lot of details and that sort of thing. But listening to somebody that doesn't sound like a good storyteller, and in fact, listen to a lot of people that don't sound like good storytellers, tell a story that they sound traumatized by. They have all the marks of trauma, all those sort of things. It's listening to those little textures in a verbal testimony that's so fascinating. And so, for instance, one of the things I suppose that's worth kind of saying up front, of course, is that those in the even in kind of with a materialist secular framework, those who are just kind of psychologists studying people like these and studying encounters like these, very often even the secular conclusion is minimally that at least these people believe that what they're saying happened to them. And that's significant. Like even in the New Testament, we talked about this, right? Some liberals, one thing they have to concede at least is whether I believe in the resurrection or not, I do have to account for the fact that they believed in the resurrection. They seem to think that this thing happened.
Right.
And that same tension, you see this with somebody like John Mack, the Harvard psychologist. He's somewhat agnostic about what any of this means. But in terms of, do these people think they saw this thing? And did they seem to see something? Maybe. He's just like psychologically, he's a top child Harvard psychologist, right? It's like it's very, very hard to find this not credible.
And that was one of the things that pushed me more toward taking this stuff seriously. Is I read one of his books, Passport to the Cosmos, where he kind of he talks a lot about the specifics of alleged abduction encounters that people came to him, because they're very traumatic. People who remember these things, it's no surprise that they maybe sometimes they're not sure if they had a bad dream, or some of them think it really happened, but they go talk to a psychologist or a therapist. And Mac interviewed hundreds of these folks, and his conclusion, like you just said, well, I don't know what's happening to these people, but I can tell you that they're not lying. They think this stuff happened, and there are weird convergences across the accounts. Like a lot of people are telling the same story over and over again. They don't know each other. There's no clear body of lore at this point. This was in the 80s and 90s that they could draw on. So yeah, that's an interesting aspect to it.
That's what in your, if you were to, because again, we're talking that boundary between sort of ironical interest and how seriously do we take these things, right? But I feel like you're somebody that can maybe taxonomize for us, like, when you see people that are interested in these kinds of things, obviously it's not just that some of the stories are incredulous. A lot of the minds that are interested in this stuff kind of want to believe every encounter story and every UFO story, every sort of I saw a strange creature story. What kinds of more or less kinds of boxes do you feel like you could put people in? That's a weird way to put that, but in other words, ranges of interests and ranges of intelligent interest in these subjects. What do you see animating the folks studying these things?
It's a good question. I know less about the people who are into it than I do about the the kind of categories of types of alleged witness. I could talk about that a little bit because I think that helped me.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so there are a bunch of, so background, there's a bunch of podcasts out there, and they're usually broken up into different kind of like segments of what we would consider the paranormal. And the uniting theme is people who have experiences where the most obvious explanation doesn't fit in with the kind of enlightenment empirical understanding of the world that you would learn in school, or that you would learn in grad school. And some, some will focus on Bigfoot, some will focus on UFO encounters, some focus on ghosts, this kind of stuff, but some of them kind of just do all the stuff. But I think there are kind of three types of people that will go on a show like that I've encountered. One is the person who, again, and I want to preface this by saying, I don't expect anyone to take any of this seriously just because I'm saying it or you're saying it. I really think this is one of those cases where you should only find this stuff credible if you listen to some of the testimonies and kind of have the experience that I, and I think you too in some cases have had, where you're like, it's hard for me to discount this person because they sound so believable, because there is something, it's strongly tied to human judgment. It's not tied to objective and empirical standards of like, dispassionate assessment. Sometimes you can just tell when you're talking to someone, I don't think this person is BSing me. I think they're telling you. So that's kind of what I'm relying on. But three categories, I would say. One is someone who you hear them start talking and you get the feel they want people to pay attention to them. And just in regular life, we all have met people like this. We've at times been that person, we want to scandalize and sensationalize and have all eyes on us. And I have a member of my family who is this sort of person regularly, and she tells me outlandish stories that I can't take seriously because I know she just wants a captive audience. So you can usually tell, like, if the witness is this kind of person, just go ahead and move on to another episode. Unless you find them personally entertaining. The second category is kind of like the geek who's excessively into paranormal stuff. These people often they call themselves like, I'm a ghost hunter, I'm a cryptid hunter. They have their own show, but they're coming on someone else's show. That doesn't necessarily mean that they haven't seen stuff, but they're going to talk about stuff that other people have told them, which could be interesting. But now you're at kind of two levels of remove from the witness. And these people, in my experience, just in general, they're maybe too interested in it. And I probably am too, but these people, they've started some kind of podcast or, organization where they go explore haunted houses or try to take pictures of Bigfoot or whatever. And so to me, they seem to have kind of compromised motives. Like they're like Fox Mulder from the X-Files. They really want to believe. And that's kind of a big grain of salt for taking what they say seriously. But the third category, which you alluded to, there are people who you hear them talk and you can just tell in some cases, they're not good at this. They're not being sensationalistic. They often sound very afraid to even kind of go back and relive the experience to tell you about it. But they're doing it because they don't understand what happened. They've often unpleasant experiences with their own therapists who, of course, for obvious and justifiable reasons, don't believe them and are kind of like reductive or like undercutting, way of explaining what happened to them. But they're insisting, like, no, this really happened. This is what I saw. In these form of these podcasts, they usually find a sympathetic host who will take them seriously, ask them questions, let them tell their story. And a big part of this, for certain kinds of experiences, like the Bigfoot stuff, the common Bigfoot experiencer of this sort is middle-aged male hunter, rural, who usually is pretty invested in his own masculinity, but has had this very unusual experience where he felt extremely diminished and overwhelmed, sort of in terms of I don't know what else to call it, but other than like the much greater masculinity of this entity that he encountered. And he's like, they're like, Some of these guys cry, they can barely talk, just recounting the story. They admit like they've soiled themselves in these encounters. And so it's this strange like self-abnegation in the account, in the telling of the tale, which adds some credibility. You know, not that it couldn't be faked, but knowing these kinds of people, they wouldn't admit to any of this stuff unless there was a really good countervailing reason. And so that to me, that makes them more believable.
Yeah, there's a lot of that to me is what's really interesting about listening to these kinds of testimonies, is there's a lot of little textures like that again, you don't get the sense that there's much sensationalizing. And if anything, in a lot of cases, it's like people are trying to underplay it. Sometimes you get the sense there's almost like qualifications in the direction of, well, maybe that was just me. There's a lot of like, I don't want to say anything inaccurate. And there's often, you're describing the kind of psychological profile just right in a lot of these encounters, and consonant with that profile. You get a lot of people that you don't get the sense that they're people of many words. And so that's another element there, is like a lot of these people do not seem like major storytellers. They don't seem like the guy that's going to be at Thanksgiving talking. They seem like quiet guys that like to be in the quiet hunting or something like that. And so when they have this story, it's hard for them even to get words out, but then they're constantly like remembering a detail and that sort of thing. And it has an air of genuine credibility. And it could be that in some cases people are credibly, hallucinating things. There's some that I've heard where I thought, people do have schizophrenia and that sort of thing. And maybe there's one or two, a handful that I've heard where it's like, I wonder if this is, somebody experiencing genuinely a kind of apparition that's just theirs. What goes against that, of course, is that there's deep, just as you were saying, when John Mack, this Harvard psychologist, starts to study these kinds of like abductee encounters, the thing that kind of creeps him out about it is that, and again, as you said, before there's a lore, before there's a taxonomy of how these encounters go, there's just non-trivial parallels across a lot of these testimonies. And it's take somebody, I think, like Jacques Vallée is the guy who comes along and sort of really makes the taxonomy for everybody. But similar in some of these stories where you're talking about meeting a strange creature in the woods, right? Maybe some of them are off, but then there's a million testimonies that all sound the same, even on points that aren't that common in the lore. It really is only by listening to these verbal testimonies that you begin to kind of hear data that's like that. Yeah, that's just straight up strange.
Yeah, I mean, that's the commonality between the cases. It's this kind of like this distributed coherence. Like these people aren't. It'd be hard to imagine that they're somehow secretly in cahoots, like getting on the same page. Once a lore develops, like we're at that point now. These podcasts kind of started about 6 or 7 years ago. At this point, if you listen to a lot of these, you could call in and you could follow the standard script because it's developed. But early on, across different shows, it was harder to think that could happen. But yeah, the insanity thing. I think part of it is the insanity is weirdly predictable. It always follows a certain script or certain kind of themes, and it happens, with different kinds of phenomena. There are more and less likely places where it will happen, and so it seems to be kind of geographically tied. Like almost no one sees Bigfoot in an urban area. They seem to be a pastoral entity. And there are certain regions of the US where there's more activity of certain kinds. And that doesn't rule out mental health issues, but it makes it seem more like it's a mind-independent phenomenon to me. Plus, I don't know. It would be such an oddly specific thing. It is true. With a lot of these people, we don't have, their medical records in front of us and, doctors that can attest like, yes, they've never been hospitalized for mental health issues. We don't have that. But I think part of this is our ability to at least in some cases, positively identify someone who's trustworthy just from the way they sound when they're talking to you. They seldom have tells or reveal things that would suggest that this is coming from a mental health kind of etiology instead of from this eyewitness account.
And and again, kind of making the parallel, not that it's a strict parallel, but making the parallel to witnesses to the resurrection. Part of what gives credibility to the resurrection accounts, of course, is that there's multiple witnesses saying roughly the same thing. And there's slight little differences between the accounts of the resurrection. I don't mean contradictions, but there's differences of accent. But as many scholars have pointed out, it's actually those differences of accent with a kind of common actual story that lend credibility to the eyewitness quality of the accounts.
Oh yeah,
that's literally. And so one of the things that really persuaded somebody like John Mack, I think, if I recall, the original case that got him interested was this just highly weird phenomenon that happened. I think it was in Zimbabwe, if I'm remembering the country correctly. And 50 kids at this Christian missionary school, 50 kids at a Christian missionary school were all at recess, and they claimed to see this kind of craft looking thing hit the ground, and some kind of weird entity around one or two around
the small grays came out.
And they all draw pictures of it, and they draw the same picture, and they all tell the story the same, but they tell it with like little kid contradictions. And that's actually, John Mack came in and said, look, if they were in cahoots, the thing is what happens when people are in cahoots is they actually tell exactly the same story.
They memorize a script. Yeah.
They memorize the details. When they're just saying, hey, we just saw this thing, and they all draw roughly the same thing, and there's little differences in all the accounts. It's like, oh, that's, and what's interesting in that particular case, I think that was maybe 30 years ago, late 80s or early 90s, if I recall. All of those children are grown now, and all of them still, there's not a single one of those kids 30, 40 years later who doesn't claim this happened. And most of their lives have been really affected by it. One in particular, the family couldn't handle it, and they just immediately moved. And she was never able to talk about it because they were Christians and Christian missionaries, I think, and they couldn't absorb they just couldn't philosophically absorb it, basically.
Like, where do aliens fit into Christian cosmology?
Yeah, exactly. And
so the account you're telling, that maybe you saw this documentary, The Phenomenon. That's where I learned about this. That's a great kind of piece of media for people who might be interested. I think it's the most credible kind of video presentation of the UFO stuff. And the makers of that film, they go and they interview these kids, now 35 years later or whatever, and they're like you said, Joe, like they're all steadfast in their claim that that, yes, this is what we saw, this did happen, and it's a pretty credible presentation.
Yeah, that, and I think the same director made another one just recently that was just about a case. It's only about one single case that happened in 1997 in Brazil, if I recall.
Yeah.
And again, it's just one of these cases where there's so many witnesses, and they all say like, and they're from different parts of the city, all experiencing some weird thing one night. And it's just, there's a lot of cases like, and I guess that brings up really maybe a central question that we want to get at, which is, in our day, I think sometimes people just poo-poo verbal testimony, right? It's kind of like, that's the least reliable thing there is. And maybe especially in our kind of post-industrial technological era, we've become, you get the sense that for a lot of people, it's like, well, we have voice recordings, we have videos now, we have DNA evidence, and those are the real reliable things. Those are the human testimony. Humans are just, they're not very reliable, and people think they saw something and they didn't. But these are the real things. And yet now what's fascinating, and Paul and I have been talking about this a little bit recently, is that maybe you're seeing a movement where those technologies, which we formerly relied upon, you hear of cases where the DNA evidence was actually, read one way and then read another, and it's not evidence that we individually know that well. Nevertheless, it seems like human reliance upon some of those technologies is in the process of changing a bit in an era where you've seen some DNA cases reversed, and you have deep fake video technology now. And so I'd just love to hear your thoughts about, what does the relationship between, I don't know, kind of these technological sources of a supposedly neutral, objective information and the fact that human beings ultimately, it seems, perhaps have to trust a person, and the reliability of a person somehow has to play a large role in justice. And
in fact, no, it's a great question, Joe. In fact, this is getting onto a series of thoughts that is really probably the only reason why I'm willing to talk about this stuff in public, because I think for me, it's mostly just a kind of a personal pastime. I don't expect anybody else to take it seriously. Sometimes I stumble across someone who's listened to a lot of the testimonies, and we have an interesting conversation, but things might be changing in the way that you suggest, because, as you said, for the last 100 or so years, we've been in this weird region of human history where we had this technology that could capture aspects of reality. We could take pictures, we could video record, we can audio record. So we could capture things that really happened, but we didn't have the technology to fake it. And I would love people who study technology. I would love to hear from them. Have there been other cases like this where, for this special time, this window, we had this objective way of proving or demonstrating whether something existed or something happened. And obviously, it's constrained to cases where you have a camera present and it's up and running. But if you do and you capture it, people have to believe you, more or less. But that's gone. The deep fake stuff is here. It's even easier with AI, and you can do videos, you can do photographs, you can do alleged audio recordings. And I think this is an area where, as a society, we're going to have to grapple with this in ways that are really interesting. And I hate this word, but they're going to be very disruptive. I think because I'm just kind of free. I'm going to free associate for a bit, then I'll bring it back to the paranormal stuff. Right now, we rely on media to know about things that happen where we're not, non-local stuff. And whether it's in another country, whether it's in the capital, whether it's in our state capital, whether it's in the next town over, for the most part. And issues of media bias aside, it's still pretty trustworthy. If you see a video, you can be pretty sure, oh, this happened. But that's going away because of the deepfake technology. And obviously, political interests, partisan interests, are strong enough where there's ample motivation to abuse this technology. It's already happening in some countries. A couple of months ago, Venezuela had created a number of AI generated news reports that looked as though they were coming from America and other countries, reinforcing the Venezuelan government's party line on some initiative they had, designed to sort of make their citizens fall in line with the program. And so it's already happening in some places, and I just think it's going to create what in philosophy we would call a defeater for evidence we get from the media. Anytime you see a video, anytime you read a story that's based on someone's account that is not someone you personally know, you're going to have the thought at the back of your mind, yeah, but did it really happen? Am I being manipulated? Was this video really a capture of something that happened in the world, or is it a deep fake? And the upshot of that, as you suggest, I think, is it's gonna valorize human testimony again. This is very long, Joe, so feel free to cut in at any time. But the narrative I kind of see is, this is how it was up until we had these technologies that allowed us to rely on them to get independent verification for eyewitness testimonies. Before that, knowledge was largely regional. You would go to a new place and say, well, what are things like here? And people would tell you, and that's all you had to go on. And if you wanted to catalog, the flora and fauna of the world, you had to go out and see what was there, and you could write it down. But post Enlightenment, the growth of modern science, our threshold, our standard for what really counted as publicly acceptable knowledge was tailored to these technologies, to things that we could control and capture in these ways. And so that made it much less harder to believe in like weird paranormal stuff, because it was harder, it was more elusive, you couldn't grasp it, it was harder to photograph. But now I wonder, bringing all this to a conclusion, I wonder if, because we're not going to be able to rely on the sort of objective view from nowhere observer aspect of video recordings and photographs, this sort of evidence, either for the news or for sort of figuring out what exists in the world, I wonder if it's going to push us back to an increased reliance on human testimony. Can I trust this person, as opposed to, well, they have a picture, so I don't care. Maybe they're terrible, but they have the photograph, so I have to believe it. And so that, I think, opens the door to saying, there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people who are saying they see this weird stuff that doesn't fit well with our kind of modern ontology, but maybe I have to take it seriously, because they're just as trustworthy as the other witnesses that I encounter to learn about the world.
Yeah, don't dismiss their lived experience.
That's right.
That's and in fact, it's funny to say that, because you get the sense that really is almost the kind of cathartic headspace in which a lot of people go to these podcasts, as you mentioned earlier, is that it's like, it winds up being a really sympathetic space, as you say, where they don't get a lot of sympathy. Like, you get a lot of them talk to their friends, and their friends are like, ah. And it does take people who are like, hey, I actually find those stories credible. I think what you said is just right. And this question of trust is fascinating to me. I just finished teaching a class for Davenant Hall on philosophy of modernity. And one of the things we read was Anthony Giddens' little interesting book, The Consequences of Modernity. And what Giddens tries to show there is that, kind of, in one sense, the whole story of modernity is a story of disembedding from time and space, and where your immediate life and your immediate time is deeply shaped by spaces and times far away from you. So yeah. Everything in your room, everything, all the clothes you're wearing, all of the things on your media screen, all of you and I right now are not in the same state.
That's right.
Such a mediation of the far away to the local in just the basic textures of our experiences. And what that tends to do to the society, and we can't fully get away from this, but what that has done over the last several hundred years is that human beings who have historically and irreducibly trusted persons, the way that we navigate the world is by trusting those whom we deem trustworthy, have increasingly had to kind of trust systems. And experts. And this is a very commented on phenomenon. The modern world requires a lot of, I don't know anything about that, but I just trust the system and the expert. A good example of that that I'm using, because Giddens develops it in a very helpful way, is something like airfare. Actually, you've probably seen that article that came out a couple of years ago that was, I can't remember what it was in. It was a major science journal, but they were like, you know what? Even scientists aren't entirely sure why airplanes work. We kind of got it, up, lift, down, yada, yada. But like the guys who really know how turbulence works and all these things are kind of like, well, but why isn't, like, but we do know is that they work.
Yeah.
What we do know is that they work super, super well. But, and this is Giddens' point, in one sense, we trust an expert. In one sense, we trust a system. But then he says, but imagine getting on an airplane with no pilot or stewardess at the front smiling at you. What if you literally felt like you were just getting on a machine and then it took off? No other difference. There's just no people at the front. And arguably, what systems have to do in the modern world to make us able to psychologically relate to them is add faces. So the pilot and the stewardess become this kind of totem of personhood on top of the system that then makes us comfortable to sit in the chair, because it's not the plane and the system and the science that have me ultimately. It's the captain who has me ultimately. And so there's this psychology of human trust, it seems to me, that actually human trust just does bottom out in a person. While we're in a context where we kind of irreducibly, as it were, trust systems, but we have to make that somehow, even if it's a little artificial, bottom out in a person. And one of the things that this whole subject brings up to me is just, are we too quick, again, these days to just say like human testimony is not reliable? But, are we too quick to forget that, well, no, unreliable human testimony is not reliable. Reliable human testimony is precisely the most reliable thing. And in fact, that's just how human beings work. And I think in a sense, but behind a lot of those who are into things like conspiracy theories and this sort of thing, as much as I disagree with all sorts of, kind of Alex Jonesy conspiracy theory sorts of things, I do think it's fascinating to recognize where most of the people that believe that come from, why they're skeptical in some ways of experts and systems. And like part of the moral system behind a lot of that is I need to trust a person that seems trustworthy, not just somebody telling me to trust them because they know a lot. And I often think of and then I'll toss it back to you, but I often think of the character of Luna Lovegood in Harry Potter, who's a conspiracy theory believer, but she's fundamentally on the side of the angels because she's ultimately an incredibly trustworthy individual, and she bonds to deeply trustworthy individuals. Like that's the moral system, even though it's kind of misfiring in all these weird ways, it's rooted in something in her that's actually quite virtuous. Whereas her father has a relationship to the conspiracy theory stuff in the Harry Potter book that's less virtuous and isn't as related to that aspect of human trust. Anyway, I'm just throwing it back to you, but it strikes me that we need to develop a kind of a more realistic epistemology, moral epistemology, perhaps of trust, like the reliability of human utterance and when we can know that, how we know that.
That raises it to me a very interesting point that I've never heard discussed or thought of. And that is, if this deep fake technology combined with currently known media biases leads to sort of our inability to generally trust non-local media, which some people call this the infocalypse, the info and apocalypse, but together.
Oh, right.
Apocalypse.
Infocalypse.
Infocalypse. It sounds like a bad word, but if that, I think, I don't know if it's going to be an apocalypse, but I think it's going to require a big change in ways that I can't foresee how it's going to go. But one upshot ought to be that it's much more difficult to buy into conspiracy theories because very rarely with conspiracy theories, at least the ones that I've heard of, and I'm not well versed in these, but the ones that I've heard of, like Pizzagate and this stuff, it's almost never someone, either oneself or someone one personally knows who sees something. Nobody found a dungeon where kids are being tortured in the back of a pizza shop and then went and told a guy, and then that guy went and showed up with an AK-47. It's always they read about something online. There's some internet cabal where they talk about stuff, but it ought to be the case that this diminishment of credibility of non-local information applies to conspiracy theories too. Will it? Knowing humans, no. But it ought to. I feel like if you can't trust CNN and the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, because for all these reasons that we've talked about, then you shouldn't trust a person on Reddit or 4chan or whatever.
Yes. And that is very often the mistake in the move is like, I can be sympathetic to I don't know if I can trust such and such and such and such and such and such. It's like, well, I'm not telling you must, but it's weird to trust Jim Bob's blog on the internet from his 2007 Blogspot comments or something like that. Nevertheless, what's going on there, arguably, I suppose, is when they're trusting a certain vibe that a person puts out. It's like what they're doing in those cases is trusting Jim Bob. He just seems like the kind of guy that thinks like I do or something like that. And that's usually where the trust is forged, which is not necessarily a good way to build trust. Thinking like you do is not the standard.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Being trustworthy is the standard, but that it does take some openness of soul and virtue to, I think, even kind of be on the look to judge who that is in some sense. So we've been talking about human trust, the relationship of these kinds of weird paranormal topics to how it highlights this conundrum of human trust, and maybe is reshaping, if it, as it were, the ecology of human trust. I guess it's worth mentioning, as we're going there, we're talking about weird things right now. I suppose it's worth mentioning, what is a non-crazy account of, very, very generally speaking. Obviously we could say a bunch of things, but very generally speaking, of what all this stuff is, because that's another thing I think you've spent a lot of time thinking about. And I suppose part of my, I should have, when you asked me how did I get into this, I mentioned you. I guess I didn't mention Mike Heiser. One of the reasons I suppose I also kind of started to really take this a little more seriously is that I was finding somebody like Mike Heiser who is just, he's just a paragon of reasonableness. He's the kind of guy who thinks, yeah, most of it's bunk. He's really good at like refuting ancient aliens. He thinks all of that's mostly just complete BS. And he's very good at kind of like, he's an actual ancient Near Eastern scholar. He gets rid of, he really debunks an enormous amount of these things that are just ridiculous. Nevertheless, he does take the kind of abductee literature fairly seriously, and things like that very seriously. And of course, if you know Michael Heiser, of course, he is going to at least suggestively relate it to, the possibility that there's kind of not aliens, not people from other planets visiting us, but maybe a lot of these things are just part of the, the under-discussed, kind of demonic and sinister angelic realm that, as you put it, in a secular kind of materialist imagination, we don't really have, except for very theoretically, much of an imagination for that aspect of reality. And so, I guess thoughts about where, as you've been thinking through these things, where do you kind of synoptically kind of place these phenomena?
Yeah, and this is the question that may get me into trouble. Here's what I'll say. If you think about witness encounters as texts, or as there's not one text, but as texts. So this is the text is, what are people saying who more or less, I think, credibly have claimed to have seen a lot of this weird stuff of many different kinds of alleged phenomena. Looking at these texts, is there a unifying explanation? What sort of picture emerges from all this stuff that people claim they're seeing? And this is, I don't know how interesting this will be for people who haven't listened to some of the accounts. So I'll keep it real short. But if you're interested, you can, find me on the internet and ask me questions, or just start listening to accounts, and I think what I say here will cohere. I think, especially if you're coming from a Christian perspective, the best interpretation of these texts, kind of putting off for a second the question of whether they're true, the interpretation, I think, would be the paranormal, for the most part, is what earlier generations would have called the underworld. It's the realm of the dead. And the stuff that people today mostly classify as paranormal, with the exception of people who might see angels, it's stuff relating to the entities that are under a curse, the curse of death, which God has instituted as a punishment for sin, whether human or angelic. And I think that, again, I'm not supporting this as evidence, but this is what I see. I think the baddies, the devil and his angels and the unclean spirits with them, and a lot of other stuff that is not usually talked about, they're working together, and they're in rebellion against the punishment that's been placed on them. I don't know if the angels are dead. There are certain passages of Scripture that suggest this. One of the Psalms, I'm forgetting what it is. It's I think it's in the early 80s or maybe 70s, but God is talking and says, you were in the divine council, but you will die like men. And the most obvious interpretation is that he's talking to these high-ranking angels, and he's telling them that because of their transgressions, they will die. Anyway, so I think the unifying theme is these are spiritual beings and the ghosts, if you will, of dead creatures who are in league with the fallen angels, and they are trying to use technology to overcome their diminished state, the curse of death. And this, I think, explains a lot of their interest in living humans. And I think this would tie in with why they do have technology. I think they do. I think a lot of the stuff that people think are aliens are really, these underworld entities that are able to use technology, and they're trying to cope with the state they've been put into.
There's in fact, interestingly, in the recent hearing before U.S. Congress, where this kind of whistleblower comes, very, very deep from, I can't remember if he was with the FBI or the CIA, the guy who they interviewed in front of Congress.
Rush?
Yes.
Yeah.
But he, one of the things he kept correcting, because in our imagination, when we think of these things, if we take it credibly, if we say people have seen a craft or something like that, it is almost always immediate that people start talking about aliens.
Yeah.
And that guy, even though he didn't use any of this language we just used, one thing he kept insisting on was, I'm not saying they come from somewhere else besides here. And even Jacques Vallée, again, who was, I don't think he's, we wouldn't consider him he's not a conservative evangelical, right? When he was studying stuff in the 60s and 70s, one of the things he concluded was, I'm not sure that whatever this isn't part of our reality, even if it's kind of like another, maybe higher dimensional reality getting into ours, or a lowered, however you understand whatever that is. But the idea being, they're not coming from way over here and then traveling from another star system. And one possibility, of course, Vallée actually entertains the possibility that entities like this, kind of maybe sinister intelligences of sorts, have always existed in the human race and taken different, sort of forms. So, you think of why were the ancient pagan temples such sites of persuasive religious impact? And a lot of that might have been that literally, if you're a Christian who believes in fallen angels and demons, that there are things going on in the temples. And Vallée is also going to talk about how in the Middle Ages, you have a lot of things that have this kind of script related to kind of encounters with saints, kind of a light, a saint presenting himself, I'm here to help you, that kind of thing. And he kind of looks at this and he's like, this taxonomy, this script is a new version of the script, but it's very similar to these other scripts. And it's in the vernacular of the people of the time. And sort of, I think what a lot of people that study these things now, and Heiser and others would be among these, might say, like, what is this? Well, this is the way you would deceive a materialist civilization, is to present yourself like, how would a materialist civilization imagine a species that was there to help you? How would you deceive them? Well, you'd present yourself as a highly advanced material civilization, and kind of create, slowly create some sort of quote unquote bond of trust. You're making the point though that's interesting, which is because in the kind of the old Enochian account, right, the image is almost like the devils or fallen angels or whatever you want to call them are giving technologies to humans to kind of enable them to transcend their limitations or something like that. But you make this point that maybe there's some use, as it were, for the technologies themselves, for for these, whatever these are.
Yeah. And again, for the listeners who are still with us, this is coming from trying to synthesize all these weird, superficially disparate pieces of data. It's like, that was part of the initial attraction for me. Is I was listening to these accounts, I'm cooking dinner, and I'm finding some of these people credible, but the story that it's emerging is just initially so perplexing. It's like, how does this fit in to anything else that I believe? Kind of like you said earlier, aliens have classically been a challenge for Christians. C.S. Lewis's efforts notwithstanding. Like, how did this? They're not in the Bible. Where would they fit in? So those kinds of thoughts. But one thing that a lot of people talk about is that, the entities that we call aliens, like the small grays, the tall grays, all the different like standard types that people wind up seeing, they're almost always very interested in human anatomy, and they go about it in a clinical way. It's not, they're here merely to frighten and to punish and rape or whatever, or molest. I mean, that does happen to people in these accounts. It's terrible, but it's almost always the entities don't seem very focused on, at least the alien type entities don't seem focused on frightening people. They seem focused on using us, getting something from us, taking blood samples, taking saliva samples, taking flesh samples, taking semen samples, all kinds of weird stuff. And a lot of people who talk to them, and again, if it's hard to trust a human, it ought to be even harder to trust an alien type being than some kind of experience. But what the entities say is, our race is, a common thing they say is, our race is dying. We're not doing well, biologically speaking. And the narrative that the alien entities give is, we're very advanced. We're much older than you. Our rate, we're kind of genetically running our course. And so we're trying to overcome the kind of, I don't know how this works biologically speaking, but we're trying to re-energize or revitalize our species by supplementation from human biology. And that, the best sense I can make of that, if you're trying to create a coherent interpretation from these texts, is, and make it cohere with a broadly traditional Christian perspective, is, well, they're dead and they don't want to be dead because it sucks to be dead. I mean, that's the whole point of death. God created it to be a punishment. And so they're trying to overcome that. And like you pointed out in these Enochian accounts, in the kind of Second Temple Judaism texts that are not a part of Scripture but have been around for a long time, which all the biblical authors would have known and probably accepted. There's a lot of talk of these early angelic guardians, the Watchers. They knew a lot about technology. They knew how to manipulate matter, and they technology to people. And that was actually part of what pissed God off. I don't think it said that we were not supposed to have these kinds of technology. We're supposed to come by them so easily. So yeah, I mean, to me that kind of fits together. If I could, I want to throw in one more thing. Just again, we're not. It would be pointless to do a deep dive into why I think this is a good interpretation, because again, I'm just a random guy in an interview. People need to listen to the testimony if they're going to find it credible, which probably they shouldn't even invest that amount of time. But maybe the single biggest persuasive thing for me in thinking that these phenomena are in the realm of what we would call spiritual, which then eventually suggested that they might be like underworld beings or the realm of the dead, is that, and this is widely attested in these accounts, these things respond to the authority of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
It's an extremely peculiar fact that
all the secular studies of this, they all say this.
Yeah, that's right. And that blew my mind. So at this point, I've heard hundreds of stories where people, whether it was Bigfoot, a werewolf-like entity, alien type entities, ghosts, you name it, almost any orbs, floating, glowing, or any paranormal phenomena, people, if they call the name of the Lord, it goes away.
Yeah.
And like you said, even secular, aficionados admit this, and they come up with, bespoke and kind of amusing explanations for why this works. My favorite is, what this shows is that the aliens have accepted the Christian narrative, and so this scares them when you invoke Jesus Christ. But this to me is, it both suggests kind of the supernatural evil component of the overall explanation, but it also, I think, for me personally as a Christian, it speaks to the credibility of these accounts, because this is another hard thing. It would be a hard thing to fake because of how controversial a specific religion is in our pluralistic age. I mean, you wouldn't have non-Christian aficionados agreeing about this. At least seems to me there'd be big incentives for them not to agree. unless it really was happening. And I've never heard anyone say, no, that doesn't really happen. They all say, yeah, whether you believe in them or not, if you tell them to stop in the name of Jesus Christ, they do.
Yep. That is a really commonly reported. That's a really commonly reported phenomenon when you listen to these testimonies. It's a very strange. Yeah, that's a very strange one. Yeah, maybe the last thing I'll bring up is, we talk a lot about transhumanism these days, and one of the things that's interesting in the kind of the old, the Genesis 6 narrative is it's inflected and interpreted through the Enochian tradition, and I think you see some of this picked up in the New Testament. Is that you can almost see, one reading of this, if we were to take kind of a sinister agent kind of interpretation, is that there's a parallel making man in the image of God. That God makes man in his own image from the dust of the ground and this sort of thing. And maybe what you see in this kind of introduction of the Nephilim, and again, this is where Heiser's so useful. He doesn't try to figure out how the mechanics of it all work out. It's just somehow the angels get involved and these weird people get born, right? However you think that worked out, something like that happened. But as that gets interpreted in the tradition, there's kind of this, there seems to be like this giving, and this is all in the human myths, this kind of giving of kind of great technologies, but maybe the crafting, and you wonder if this is part of what these weird births are, the crafting of a kind of, as it were, human that's made after the image of the angels. If you take the interpretation that angels have always been jealous of man, because man is destined to be higher than the angels. One thing that you could see angels, sinister angelic creatures, is always interested in, I suppose, is the crafting of the human after their own image. And so you get these extraordinarily violent sorts of creatures. And you wonder if some of these phenomenon are I don't know, the crafting of, that's incredibly highly speculative. This is really me just putting on the trying to pull the categories and then say, if I was just a guy who experienced something like this, what bucket would I put it in? Would it be something like that bucket?
You mean like the stuff they call cryptids?
Yeah, like in other words, that interest in genetics, and again, like is all of this completely wrong, and 100% of these guys just are completely maybe that's true. But if and I like the way you put it, if this series of texts is true and people claim to have experienced or at least seen it, claim to have experienced these images, even just the icons themselves are just completely fascinating. And the question, and part of the question then becomes is this does this vaguely signal in some way that very, an ancient thing that we've always known, which is that these sinister agents are interested in crafting the human race after their image and in a very destructive way. And you put that together with kind of modern transhumanist movements. And I think Lewis is thinking this way, and that Hideous Strength, there's a sense that that there's a demonic program involved in the desire to transcend the body. And it's fascinating to me that theme in these encounter stories, that theme of some fascination with the human body, transcending the body, and then all the phenomenon around it are biological. They seem to just reflect this interest in biology and maybe are creatures whose biology, who are apart from some limiting power, might be otherwise very violent. Or something like that.
That could be. That's an interesting interpretation. That the motive behind, angels messing around with human beings, which is in the, it's a long-standing tradition. It's in Genesis 6, kind of in passing. But in the Enoch, Book of Giants, Jubilees, these kinds of texts, I guess that's possible. To me, what the text, what these like pseudepigraphical texts suggest is that the angels lusted. They saw human women and were like, they are awesome. Let's, so that but that doesn't mean like the texts are telling us all their motivations. It could have been more oriented toward procreation and less toward just, lust without further thought for the implications. So that could be a great explanation. I've never thought about that. I'll have to think about that more.
Yeah. Well, and obviously we're putting on our old man boomer hats here, and I'm sitting on a porch and we're talking about Bigfoot and aliens and that sort of thing. And again, we're not talking about it as people who are ideologically committed to some paradigm about it. It's like, again, who knows? There's really a big who knows. Rather, nevertheless, I think there is some attempt to say it's worth some Christians, it's worth some people putting in the effort to say, like, maybe there's something to that collection of phenomenon that's not completely crazy. And I think it's worth getting voices and minds in on that kind of project that aren't so disposed towards credulousness. And that can pull in philosophical and theological categories that maybe help unite some of this. Because again, a lot of the people, and I think this is significant to reiterate, part of what lends credibility to a lot of the verbal testimonies is that none of them do what we're doing right now. Most of them do not sit around trying to figure, like, when it comes to, like, what was this? What box do I put it in? Those who've experienced it, when I listen to their testimonies, they are usually the last people to make any dogmatic claim about what they experienced. Usually when they do, interestingly, this is the most common thing I hear. The most common thing I hear is some interpretation that has something to do with demonic, sinister agent kind of thing. That's at least a very increasingly common interpretation of one's own experiences. But again, most of the people I've heard are very non-speculative about it. It's just mostly a trauma that they don't know what to do with.
No, that's right. And just going back to your earlier point for a second, I think you're right that I think there is value in some people diving into this stuff. Hopefully I'm one of those people, because it's too late. I've already done it. But part of it is, I think, because, and to me, this is in general a kind of intellectual virtue. I think not just Christians, but human beings need to be more willing to build speculative theories, like theories we were saying, like, I'm going to put these pieces together and I don't know if the theory is true yet. Kind of think of it as like, philosophers like to talk about how credence can fall between 0, meaning like you totally reject it, and 1, meaning you're totally certain. But there's a huge range of like options in between. You can build a theory and say, I don't accept this. Like, my credence for this isn't certain. Maybe I don't even find it probable, but I haven't fully explained the world to myself yet. And so I may learn new things. And as I learn new things, how credible I find these theories, that like those values may change. I'm really talking like an analytic philosopher now, but I think hopefully the model makes sense. And so when I listen to these accounts, I'm building theories, not that I accept, but to make sense of the data that I'm hearing. And as I learn new things, how credible or incredible that I find them, that changes. For instance, David Grush and his, the whistleblower and the stuff that he said to Congress, he said a lot of things that Heiser has said in the past, or that has been said in texts that Heiser recommended. And so for me, that's a new piece of evidence that raises the credibility of theories that involve that kind of narrative to some degree, because here's this guy who's willing, frankly, to put his life on the line and really risk making himself look like an idiot to say this stuff. So I think that's one way in which this kind of stuff can be valuable. Probably we shouldn't all do it. Hopefully you and I should. And secondly, there may be at times practical value. I don't know if we've talked about this, but there's this new kind of conversational theme in the world of people who call themselves energy workers. They tend to be people who have been really into yoga. They're usually into astrology and the horoscope. They're into crystals, the healing power of crystals. There are a lot of them in areas of Brooklyn, and it's kind of like an alternative medicine, new thought, like 21st century hippies. But part of it is like, guys, there's these energies that are out there, and we can like interact with them, and you can like, your life can go better if you get your energies right. But there's this new movement of a number of energy workers who are converting to Christianity because they became convinced of, well, not only are there in fact energies according to these people, but they're agencies, and some of the agencies are evil. And now the picture that I'm interacting with is weirdly close to kind of an age-old Christian cosmology. And a great person to look up is Caroline Dooner. She got famous for writing a bestseller called The Fuck It Diet. You may have to edit that. That's the title of the book. But she got into energy work, and then she wound up converting to Christianity, and she goes into all this on her I think it's a Substack. Her last name is Dooner, Caroline Dooner. But they're fascinating stories. And I think if you've spent some time trying to get some kind of theory of what this stuff is, then when you come across what these energy work, for instance, there is an immediate practical application. Like, when I hear what her and her energy worker friends talk about, I think, well, I have a pretty good guess about what's happening. And so, yeah, this is a long-winded way of saying I agree with you. There is some value in it. Is it the most important thing? No.
Yeah, of course not. No.
As long as I'm cooking dinners, I tell myself I can keep listening to these podcasts.
This is exactly when I listen, is exactly when I'm cooking dinner. Though it's interesting, I won't say who it is because he'll probably hear this podcast, but I was out with a local pastor recently, and we were talking about a little group I'm going to put on in the South Carolina area called Darts, dialogue about really tricky stuff. And the premise is, hey, civilization is falling apart. Let's talk about tricky things and not do that. And so you meet at a bar, and Christian, bring your buddy, it can be non-Christians, that sort of thing. And so I was talking to a local pastor, and was, saying like, what kinds of articles should I pick? I was telling him, this is a cool documentary. This is an interesting article. I'm trying to pick kind of non-culture war signaling things, but that are just like Wilfred McClay's The Strange Persistence of Guilt.
Oh man, great piece.
Those kinds of things. And when I asked him, like, what do you think is just something people would come together and talk about and get into something Christian over? And he had a Sasquatch sticker on his phone. Ironically, he had an ironic Sasquatch sticker. And then he just pointed at it and he said, honestly, in this area, if you talked about that out loud, an enormous amount of people would want to talk about it. Huh. So it's interesting. In one sense, it's like, yes, maybe there are only a handful of people that quote, quote, should get into it. I think it's becoming, in the conversational hive mind in America, a bigger conversation. Some of this because of Congress, and because there's just more and more credible people who don't have the typical script, right? Who seem to be taking it somewhat seriously. I would definitely agree with Paul that the average Christian doesn't need to get obsessed with these things. A lot of people, like you, I do a lot of this when I'm cooking food. I find it interesting because I think it's becoming a bigger cultural conversation, but also for reasons that you're pointing out. I suppose I think about it. I've been very interested, not just by kind of cult formation since the 60s. Watching how cults have formed since the 60s is a really, really fascinating phenomenon to me. But then to think about ways in which we're almost civilizationally a cult, the way in which we live inside of cult headspace, but at just a very successful hive mind level, and how it seems to me, quite literally, sinister agents can colonize that. I think if nothing else, bringing back the language of deceivers trying to manipulate the fact that you live in a materialist civilization and have a materialist imagination. I think having that as a functioning set of registers on which we're analyzing our own life and experiences, I think that's actually very, very useful. And so in one sense, it's like, sometimes for me, listening to these things is useful in the same way that reading That Hideous Strength is useful for me. It's not really that like there's a story exactly like That Hideous Strength out there. It's that nevertheless, this is a good set of moving parts that help me think through what would it look like, in a sense, or to imagine what might it look like if demonic agencies were trying to deceive people that were very much like us. And I think Lewis at least asks a question like that. I think these sorts of discussions, in addition to bringing up this question of the value of human testimony, also forces us to ask what kind of face might the demonic take in a context very much like ours. And it is kind of these sorts of things you talk about, right? It's like a lot of that stuff probably starts out very ironic. It's sort of like, oh, of course, none of this is that serious, but I'm really into crystals now. And then it's like, but you can meme yourself beyond irony. and then discover, oh, the world is weirder, much, much weirder than I thought.
There was a hilarious testimony that I heard recently on where this woman called in and she was like, so I don't know, but there's apparently this channel that Gwyneth Paltrow has where she like sells lifestyle products and like cosmetics. And there was some like ritual that some person that Gwyneth Paltrow had on the channel did to like cleanse a space. And this woman who's called into this podcast, she was like, my friends and I watched her show ironically to make fun of it. And we decided to do the ritual just for kicks. So we did it. And then most of her story related to how one of the other women who was in the story started feeling that there was a presence in her house at night. And wherever she would go, dogs would bark at her, like just viciously bark at her. And the suggestion, the best interpretation this woman could come up with was, we did the ritual as a joke, but it worked. And like we summoned something and we've had a hard time getting it to go away. Thanks, Gwyneth Paltrow. But but just on that tack of like people get into it maybe ironically, or they don't know what they're messing with. This is an age-old tale, like don't play with a Ouija board, kids. But people are telling stories like this, and maybe they're true. Yeah.
Well, this is hopefully the first of probably several conversations about this, because not necessarily that they're right in succession, but it's worth it maybe at some point even getting down into, what are the more particular things that people claim they're seeing? What's kind of the range of phenomenon out there? What's obviously kind of bunk? There's obviously some of these things, even some things that are multiply attested that seem to have very little credibility behind them. But then there's others that aren't like that. And so maybe it would be at some point for if folks are interested, and really, again, not just for kicks, but actually as an exercise in a sense, an exercise of imaginatively and philosophically thinking through phenomena like this, but also as an exercise in thinking through how to discern credible versus non-credible explanation or testimony about as the famous quote is, of relatively incredible things. Any last thoughts? I think maybe before we go, you wanted to, for those who are just kind of interested in cooking a long dinner and listening to like, hey, pick one down, see what you think.
And like I think as we've communicated pretty well all along, take it all with a grain of salt. I mean, as I tell people, worst case scenario, you'll hear a good story. We all like reading good fiction. But what happened to me may happen to you, is that you may be listening to the fiction and be like, this I'm not sure this is fiction. So some of the better podcasts, in my opinion, so for like Bigfoot stuff, which is usually the gateway drug for a lot of people, Sasquatch Chronicles, probably the oldest one. There are maybe 1,000 episodes. There's one I think the similarly titled UFO Chronicles. It's just what I like about UFO Chronicles is there's very minimal host engagement. Some of these shows, the host just talks way too much. You want to be like, let the people tell their stories. UFO Chronicles, this British dude just lets people tell their story about UFO encounters they had. An interesting one is called Strange Familiars, which is basically anything weird that people have experienced that they want to talk about, they call in. And there's some pretty good accounts on there. I'll say two more. There's one that there aren't too many episodes on this one, but it's pretty interesting. It's pretty well done. It's called Otherworld. And all these are on Spotify, I'm pretty sure. If not Spotify, then on YouTube. And the last one, the most bonkers one, if you really want to go down the rabbit hole, Dogman Encounters. It's a good time. No matter what you think about it, some good stories on there. So those are recommendations for dinner time, or while you're cooking, turn on an episode and see what you think.
Yes, in fact, I think the particular person I was talking to in the area this week, I think the sticker on his phone apparently started out as a kind of ironic thing. His wife, I believe, was trolling him and was trying to treat him as like a boomer male. It's like, ha ha ha, boomer males that are into Bigfoot and Sasquatch, and started putting stickers of this stuff all over his stuff. And I don't know if she now regrets it, because apparently that ironic joke did turn into, well, he goes and studies some of the phenomena. But I don't know, maybe there's something to this.
My wife does the same thing. I found a Bigfoot parking sign in my office one day after I'd had a meeting in there. I was just like, oh man, I didn't need that.
Getting trolled. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But you beware what you troll your husband with, because you never know what he's going to wind up as. So,
or how other people will take it. Like, oh, I'm so glad you're interested in this. Let's talk about it. And it's just like, oh, this backfired.
That's right. Well, thanks again, Paul, for coming on today to talk about these things. I hope we always have Paul come on to talk about the most interesting things. But normally Dale's here to take us out, so I'm not very well scripted at this, but I believe the idea is you can find us on all the podcast catchers and such, and thus and such, ending podcast jibber jabber that I'll just call that concluded. But Paul, thanks again for coming on today.
Joe, thank you. Great conversation. Not one I've been able to have very often, and hopefully we both don't get canceled.
That's right. That's
until
right.
Next time.
Don't cancel us. Just share this with your friends. That's what we prefer. Good to see. Good to